In the unforgiving heartland, where fortunes are built on grit and destroyed by greed, a new legend is about to be told. Before the harvest begins, offer your tribute. If you believe in the triumph of the underdog, show your support with a like. Join our community by subscribing, so you won't miss the secrets buried in the land. Now, prepare yourselves for a story carved from the very bones of the earth, a testament to a debt that could not be paid in silver or gold. There are truths that only reveal themselves when everything we know falls apart. For Silas Blackwood, that truth arrived on a Tuesday night, painted across the sky in the color of a festering wound. The first thing he noticed was the light. It was wrong. Instead of the deep, velvet blackness stitched with the silver of starlight he had known for 40 years, the sky pulsed with a sick, angry orange. It was weeping all over his land, a toxic luminescence that bleached the familiar shadows of the pines and threw the jagged silhouette of his small cabin into stark relief. He was on the porch, a half-empty mug of chicory coffee growing cold in his calloused hands, when the scent hit him, a violation of the night's clean air. It was not the familiar perfume of pine and damp earth, but the acrid, chemical stench of accelerant and the bitter, throat-catching smoke of old, burning timber. The smell of murder. His barn. The barn his grandfather had raised with his own 2 hands, its massive timbers hewn from the very forest it now overlooked, was being devoured by a monstrous, roaring flame. It had stood against a century of blizzards, droughts, and the slow, grinding passage of time. Now, it was dying in minutes. For Silas, the truth solidifying in the gut-wrenching heat was this. He was no longer just losing his land to the sterile machinations of a bank. He was being erased from it, his history scoured from the earth by fire. He didn't run. He didn't scream. Panic was a luxury for men who had something left to lose, a currency for those with a future still to protect. He simply stood, a statue carved from generations of grief, and watched the heart of his legacy turn to ash. The crackle of the flames was a hungry, living sound, a predator's feast punctuated by the tortured groan of collapsing beams, each one a memory, a season of labor, a piece of his soul surrendering to the inferno. Then a second sound reached him, an intrusion far more vulgar than the fire. The crunch of expensive tires on his gravel driveway. A sleek, black SUV, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the hellscape of the fire, rolled to a stop. Its LED headlights cut through the smoke, pinning him in their sterile white glare like a specimen under a microscope. The vehicle was an obscenity in this place of dirt and struggle, a piece of the city that had slithered into the wilderness to poison it from the inside out. The passenger door opened with an expensive, muted click, and a man stepped out. Arthur Vance. He was dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Silas's entire property was worth, according to the bank's predatory valuation. His shoes were Italian leather, ridiculously out of place on the dusty ground, their shine an insult to the earth they stood on. He didn't look at the fire. He didn't acknowledge the destruction he had clearly orchestrated. He looked only at Silas, a smile playing on his thin lips that was more predator than human, a twisting of flesh that conveyed nothing but contemptuous power. Behind him, 3 other men emerged from the SUV. They were not smiling. They were thick-necked and broad-shouldered, lumps of muscle and menace who moved with the lazy confidence of men paid to break things, both spirit and bone. One of them carried a jerry can, its red plastic gleaming in the firelight like a drop of fresh blood. Another held a thick sheaf of papers, a weapon far more dangerous than the can of gasoline. "Evening, Silas," Vance said, his voice as smooth and suffocating as a silk scarf pulled tight around the throat. "Doing a little redecorating, are we? Clearing out the old to make way for the new." Silas's hands tightened on his mug, the ceramic groaning under the pressure until a hairline fracture snaked across its surface. He said nothing. Words were a currency he rarely dealt in, a coin devalued by the lies of men like Vance. His silence was a wall, the only fortification he had left. "Look," Vance sighed, performing a caricature of patience that was more insulting than any outburst. "Let's not drag this out. My associates and I have had a long day. The bank has foreclosed. I hold the note. This land is for all intents and purposes mine. These papers just make it official, a quitclaim deed. You sign it, walk away with $1,000 for your trouble, and I'll choose to forget this unfortunate piece of arson ever happened." He made a small, dismissive gesture toward the inferno, as if it were a minor inconvenience, a bit of untidy housekeeping. He nodded to the man with the papers, who stepped forward and thrust them toward Silas. The contract smelled of ink and corporate indifference. It was a death warrant for everything he had ever known, for the legacy of calloused hands and honest sweat that was his only inheritance. Silas looked from the papers to the burning barn, its skeletal frame now stark against the swirling embers. In the roiling heart of the flames, he saw his grandfather's face, etched with determination. He saw his father's quiet pride, a strength that didn't need words. He saw a lifetime of solitude that had never once felt like loneliness, because the land itself had been his companion. "No," Silas said. The word was quiet, rough from disuse, but it landed in the space between them with the weight of a granite boulder. It was not a refusal, it was a declaration of war. Vance's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, flat anger. "No, I don't think you understand your position. The sheriff is indisposed. The fire department seems to have lost your address. You're all alone out here, old man. No one is coming to help you." He took a step closer, his expensive cologne a foul, cloying intrusion in the night air. "My associate over there still has some gasoline left. Your house is made of the same old, dry wood as that barn. Sign the papers or we make this a much warmer evening for you." He paused, letting the threat settle. "You have 24 hours to reconsider, but I'd think fast. Accidents happen out here, terribly lonely accidents." The three thugs fanned out, a silent, looming threat that bracketed Silas on his own porch. The message was clear. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an extinction event. As Vance and his crew climbed back into their metallic beast and drove away, leaving Silas bathed in the dying, malevolent light of his past, the cold reality settled in his bones. He was alone. The law was a fiction, a tool wielded by men like Vance to legitimize their greed. The community, the small town nestled in the valley below, had long since written him off as the crazy hermit on the hill, a relic of a bygone era. He had nothing but the dirt under his feet and the wild, dark woods at his back. He sank onto the porch steps, the heat from the fire a poor substitute for the warmth that had been stolen from him. His world had been reduced to a choice between erasure and annihilation. And in that suffocating darkness, with the smell of his burning history filling his lungs, his mind fled, seeking refuge in a memory from a different time, a time when a single act of mercy had unknowingly planted the seeds of his only possible salvation. He didn't sleep. Sleep was a surrender he couldn't afford. As the last embers of the barn pulsed like a dying heart against the pre-dawn gray, Silas moved. The 24-hour deadline wasn't a reprieve. It was a countdown timer on his life. He limped back into his cabin, the splinters of his coffee mug still clutched in one hand, and let them fall into the cold sink. The pain in his knuckles was a grounding reality in a world that had become a nightmare. He moved with a grim, methodical purpose, his actions stripped of all hope, fueled only by a bedrock of pure defiance. He wasn't a fool. He knew Vance would be back, and they wouldn't be bringing flowers. He spent the morning in a haze of grim preparation. He boarded up the lower windows of his cabin with planks pried from a collapsed section of the corn crib, each nail a punctuation mark in a silent prayer of defiance. He checked the action on his grandfather's old 12-gauge shotgun, the steel cool and solid in his hands. It was a simple, honest machine, a tool for hunting, not for killing men. He had 5 shells. It felt like 5 pebbles against an avalanche, but they were his pebbles and he would throw them. He didn't consider running. This land was in his blood, its soil mixed with the dust of his ancestors. To leave would be to die in a way that a bullet or a fire could not accomplish. He was a taproot, sunk deep into this place, and he would not be ripped out. As he worked, his mind, a fortress under siege, retreated to its deepest vaults. 3 years earlier, the autumn had been sharp and unforgiving. The air, crisp with the coming frost, carried the scent of decaying leaves and the promise of a hard winter. Silas was walking the northern perimeter of his property, a line where his ragged cornfields gave way to the dense, untamed forest that stretched for 100 miles. He preferred this borderland, a place where the world of man and the world of the wild bled into one another. He understood its language, the snap of a twig, the rustle of unseen things, the silent conversation of the trees. It was on one of these patrols, meant to check for downed fences or signs of poachers, that he heard it. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a thin, desperate whimpering, almost lost in the sigh of the wind through the pines. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated misery. Silas froze, his senses, honed by a lifetime of solitude, on high alert. He moved toward the sound with a woodsman's silence, his worn boots making no impression on the thick carpet of pine needles. The whimpering grew louder, punctuated by a frantic metallic clinking. He found it nestled in a small clearing, almost invisible beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. A bear trap, old, rusted, and illegal as hell. Its jagged steel teeth were clamped shut, and caught within their brutal embrace was not a bear, but the slender, fragile leg of a wolf pup. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, its coat a mottled gray and brown, its body trembling violently with pain and terror. It was the runt of its litter, he could tell, small, scrawny, and hopelessly outmatched by the cold, indifferent iron that held it fast. When it saw him, it tried to snarl, a pathetic attempt at ferocity that ended in another pained yelp. Its amber eyes, wide with panic, fixed on him. Silas felt a familiar, cold anger rise in his chest. Traps like these were indiscriminate, instruments of torture left by lazy, cruel men. He had found deer in them, raccoons, even a golden eagle once, its magnificent wings shattered beyond repair. But a wolf, that was different. The local ranchers and farmers considered them vermin, killers to be shot on sight. They were ghosts in the woods, hated and feared, blamed for every lost calf or sheep. The smart thing to do, the safe thing, would be to put the creature out of its misery. A single, merciful shot, end its suffering and eliminate a future predator. He rested his hand on the butt of the old hunting rifle slung over his shoulder, but as he looked into those terrified amber eyes, he didn't see a monster. He saw a child. He saw the same raw fear he'd seen in a fawn separated from its mother, the same desperate, primal will to live. The pup wasn't fighting him. It was fighting the trap, the pain, the sheer injustice of its fate. In that small, trembling creature, Silas saw a reflection of himself, cornered, isolated, and judged by a world that didn't understand him. In that moment, he made a decision that went against all logic and local wisdom. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, a silent negotiation with the terrified animal. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice a low rumble, the same tone he used to soothe a spooked horse. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The pup flinched but didn't snap. It seemed to sense something in his tone, a lack of aggression that confused its instincts. Carefully, Silas laid his rifle on the ground, a gesture of peace understood across species. Prying open a bear trap was a dangerous two-man job. The springs were immensely powerful, designed to snap bone. He found a sturdy branch, thick as his wrist, and used it as a lever, placing it between the jaws and putting all of his weight onto it. The muscles in his back and shoulders screamed in protest. Sweat beaded on his forehead, dripping into his eyes. The rusted metal groaned, resisting him with the stubbornness of a century. The pup cried out as the pressure shifted on its mangled leg. "Almost there," Silas grunted, his teeth clenched, straining against the unyielding steel. "Hold on." With a final explosive effort that sent a jolt of pain up his spine, the jaws sprang open by a few precious inches. It was enough. The pup, with a surge of adrenaline, yanked its leg free. It collapsed onto the forest floor, whimpering, licking at the bloody, crushed limb. The leg was a mess, broken in at least 2 places, the flesh torn to the bone. It would never survive on its own. The pack, governed by the brutal calculus of survival, would have to leave it behind. Infection would set in, and a slow, agonizing death would follow. Silas knew he was crossing a line, meddling with a natural order that was meant to be cruel. But he couldn't leave it. In the face of such calculated human cruelty, nature's indifference seemed like a mercy. He shrugged off his thick canvas jacket and gently wrapped the trembling pup in it. The creature was surprisingly light, a bundle of sharp bones and terrified energy. It went limp in his arms, too exhausted and pained to fight anymore. As he carried it back toward his cabin, he could feel the faint, rapid beating of its heart against his chest. He didn't know it then, but he wasn't just carrying a wounded animal. He was carrying a promise, forging a bond with a power far older and more patient than any developer's contract or banker's ledger. He was rewriting a debt, not with ink, but with compassion. He set the pup down on an old horse blanket by the stone hearth in his small, cluttered cabin. The fire was low, casting gentle shadows that danced on the rough-hewn wooden walls. For the first time, the pup seemed to relax, the warmth seeping into its shivering body. Silas worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency. He had set his own broken bones before, splinted the legs of deer caught in fences. He was a mender of broken things. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such rough hands. The pup winced and let out a low growl, but it didn't bite. It seemed to understand on some primal level that this pain was meant to help. He fashioned a splint from 2 pieces of kindling and strips of clean cloth, immobilizing the shattered leg. The pup watched him the entire time, its intelligent eyes tracking his every move, its fear slowly being replaced by a wary curiosity. When he was done, he offered it a bowl of water, which it lapped up greedily. He then heated some leftover venison stew, picking out the meat and letting it cool before placing it near the pup's nose. It hesitated for a moment, the scent of a predator on the food, then its desperate hunger won out and it devoured the meal. For the next 6 weeks, the cabin had 2 occupants. Silas called the pup Runt, not as an insult, but as a simple statement of fact, a name rooted in the reality of its struggle. Runt was a quiet patient. It slept most of the time, its body focused on the monumental task of healing. Silas would change the dressing every day, checking for signs of infection. He talked to it, not in a sentimental way, but as he would to any living thing on his property. He told it about the changing weather, about the deer grazing in the corn stubble, about the stubbornness of the old water pump. And Runt would listen, its ears twitching, its amber eyes seeming to comprehend more than any animal should. A strange and silent friendship formed between the man who preferred animals to people and the animal who had only ever known the cruelty of man. Runt never became a pet. It retained its wildness, a core of untamable spirit that Silas deeply respected. It never licked his hand or curled up at his feet, but it would allow him to sit close. Sometimes in the dead of night, he would wake to find the pup sitting up, watching him with an unnerving intensity, a silent guardian in the flickering firelight. The day the splint came off was a quiet milestone. The leg was healed, though it would always carry a scar and cause the wolf to walk with a slight limp. It was thinner than the other legs, the muscles not as developed, but it was strong. Runt tested it, walking around the cabin with a newfound confidence. The call of the wild, dormant during its convalescence, was reawakening. It started pacing by the door, sniffing at the cracks, its nose pointed toward the forest. It would stare out the window for hours, a low whine emanating from its throat. Silas knew it was time. To keep it would be a different kind of cruelty, a cage of kindness. One crisp morning, when the sun was a pale disk in the winter sky, he opened the cabin door. He didn't say anything. He just stood aside. Runt limped to the threshold and paused, looking back at him. For a long moment their eyes met. There was no sentimentality in the wolf's gaze, but there was a profound and clear acknowledgement, a recognition of the debt. Then, without a sound, it turned and trotted out into the snow-dusted yard. It moved toward the tree line, its limp barely noticeable. At the edge of the forest, it stopped one last time and looked back, a final, silent farewell. Then it vanished into the shadows of the pines. Silas stood at the door for a long time, the cold air biting at his skin, feeling a sense of loss that was deeper and more acute than he had felt in years. He had done the right thing, but his world suddenly felt much emptier. He had saved a life, and in doing so, had given a piece of his own solitude away. He didn't know if he would ever see the wolf again. He didn't know that the debt he had paid on its behalf was now an investment, silently accruing interest in the wild, patient heart of the wilderness. The memory offered no comfort now, only a stark contrast to the ugliness of his present. The sun climbed higher, a witness to his grim work, but preparation wasn't a plan. He needed to understand what he was up against. Vance wasn't just a corporate raider. He was a symptom of a rot that went deeper. Driven by a desperate, flickering ember of hope, Silas decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He was going to town. He started at the barn. The embers had cooled enough for him to walk the perimeter of the foundation. The smell of wet ash and scorched earth was a physical weight in the air. He wasn't looking for sentiment. He was looking for evidence. His eyes, accustomed to spotting a deer mouse at 50 yards, scanned the ground. He found what he was looking for near the collapsed rear wall, a single, clear tire track in a patch of soft mud, partially obscured by the debris from the firefighting efforts that never came. It was deep-set, the tread aggressive and unfamiliar. It didn't match the expensive, all-season radials on Vance's SUV. This was a heavy-duty truck. Someone else had been here. He followed the faint impression back toward a disused logging trail that snaked away into the state forest. A few hundred yards in, he found more. Faint survey markers, nearly hidden in the undergrowth. Not for property lines, but for something else. They were numbered, with flags of a specific color he didn't recognize. He pulled one from the ground. It felt cold, alien. Vance hadn't just wanted his land for a lakeside resort, as the rumors in town had suggested. That was a lie, a smokescreen. This was about something under the ground. Water rights, mineral deposits. Silas didn't know, but the mystery deepened the conspiracy, making it feel vast and impenetrable. He was no longer fighting a man for a farm. He was standing in the way of an industrial extraction, a force that saw his home not as a legacy, but as an obstacle on a balance sheet. The realization didn't bring more fear, only a cold, clarifying rage. He fired up his old Ford pickup, the engine turning over with a reluctant groan. The drive into Blackwood Creek, the town his great-grandfather had helped found, felt like a journey to a foreign country. The truck rattled and shook, every loose bolt a testament to years of neglect, a mirror of its owner. The town itself was just as weathered. Main Street was a collection of faded brick facades and empty storefronts. The prosperity had been siphoned off years ago, leaving a husk. His first stop was the sheriff's office. The sign swung on a single rusty hinge. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and apathy. Sheriff Miller was a large man, his uniform straining at the seams, his face a fleshy mask of calculated indifference. He was leaning back in his chair, boots up on his desk, reading a fishing magazine. He didn't get up. "Silas," he said, his voice flat, devoid of surprise. "Been a while. What can I do for you?" Silas stood before the desk, holding the survey marker like an artifact from a crime scene. "My barn was burned down last night, Miller. Arthur Vance was there. He threatened to burn my house down next if I don't sign over my land." Miller slowly lowered his magazine, his eyes lingering on it for a moment before deigning to look at Silas. "That's a serious accusation. You got any proof?" "I have my word. I have the ashes of a 100-year-old barn." "Vance is a respectable businessman," Miller said, the words sounding rehearsed. "Big plans for this county, bringing in jobs. He was probably just checking on the property, bank business. As for the fire, well, you live out there all alone. Old wiring, maybe, a lightning strike." "There was no storm," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I saw his men with a gas can." He placed the survey marker on the desk. "I found this on my property. What is it?" Miller glanced at the marker, and his expression tightened for a fraction of a second. It was the flicker of a liar caught unawares. "Looks like county survey stuff. They're always marking things." He pushed it back towards Silas with a pudgy finger. "Listen, Silas, I can't go chasing shadows based on the word of, well, you know. People get confused, especially when they're under financial stress. The bank owns that land now. It's their problem. My advice: take whatever deal Vance is offering you and move on." The dismissal was absolute. The law in Blackwood Creek had been bought and paid for. "So you're not going to do anything?" Silas asked, the question a formality. "Nothing to be done," Miller said, picking up his magazine again. "It's a civil matter." Silas left the office, the door closing behind him with a sound of finality. He was an outsider in his own town, a ghost haunting the streets his family had built. He made one last stop at the general store, a place that had once been the town's social hub. Martha, the owner, had known him since he was a boy. She was behind the counter, her face etched with a familiar worry. When she saw him, her eyes darted toward the front window, then back at him. Fear. It was a new look on her. "Silas," she said, her voice a hushed whisper, "you shouldn't be here. I need to know what Vance is really doing, Martha. People are scared, you're scared." She began wiping the already clean counter with a frantic energy. "He's buying up everything. The old logging company land, the Miller farm. Anyone who doesn't sell finds themselves in trouble. Audits from the IRS, permits getting denied, wells drying up mysteriously." She leaned closer. "They say he's looking for shale gas, fracking. He's promising jobs, but he's gutting the place. People are taking his money and getting out while they can. Don't fight him, Silas. You can't win." The pieces clicked into place. The second truck, the survey markers, the town's fear. It was a corporate invasion disguised as progress. He wasn't just losing his farm. His entire world was being poisoned for profit. He bought a box of shotgun shells, number 4 buckshot, heavy and uncompromising, and a bag of coffee. The transaction was tense, silent. As he left, Martha wouldn't meet his eyes. The last thread of community had been severed. He was utterly, completely on his own. Defeated, Silas drove back to his land, the new box of shells a cold weight on the seat beside him. He didn't go to the cabin. He went to the woods. He walked the northern perimeter, the one place that felt untainted, his only true sanctuary. The air was cleaner here, the silence deeper. He walked not as a patrol, but as a man saying goodbye to the only thing he had ever truly loved. He ran a hand over the bark of a great oak his grandfather had called the Sentinel. He remembered his father teaching him how to read the forest floor, to tell the story of the night from the tracks left in the dirt. He sat on a moss-covered rock overlooking the valley, the town a distant, insignificant smudge below. He felt the crushing weight of a century of legacy on his shoulders, and for the first time he felt it as a burden, not an honor. He had failed them. His ancestors who had carved this life from the wilderness, his father who had handed him the deed with the simple words, "Don't lose it." He was about to lose it all. Resignation began to seep into his bones, a cold poison more potent than any fear. He lowered his head into his hands, the rough texture of his palms a familiar landscape of failure. And then he saw it. There in the soft earth at his feet was a track, a paw print large and clear. And in the impression made by the right forepaw, a slight, almost imperceptible drag, a flaw in the perfect symmetry of the stride. His breath caught in his throat. He looked up, scanning the silent woods. He saw nothing, heard nothing, but he knew he was not alone. The knowledge didn't form a plan, not yet, but it was a presence, a flicker of warmth against the encroaching cold. Hope, not as a strategy, but as a wild, untamable thing, was still alive in these woods. The 24 hours were almost up. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the smoke-stained clouds in hues of purple and bruised orange, a profound calm settled over him. It wasn't peace. It wasn't resignation. It was a grim, feral resolve. He had gone to the world of men for justice and found only corruption and fear. The law of the town was broken, so he would have to rely on the law of the wild. He returned to the cabin, the hunter's instinct he had suppressed for decades now fully awake. His innovation would not be a clever legal trick or a desperate plea for help. It would be an acceptance of who he was, a creature of this land defending his territory. He loaded the shotgun, chambering one of the new, heavier shells. He didn't board up any more windows. He opened one at the back of the house, the one facing the deep woods, creating an escape route not for himself, but for the possibility of another way. He sat in his worn armchair, the shotgun resting across his lap, and waited. The familiar sounds of the night were absent. The crickets were silent. The owls were not hunting. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for the violence to come. The only sound was the steady, calm beating of his own heart. Right on schedule, the headlights sliced through the gloom. The black SUV crunched up the driveway again, this time parking directly in front of the porch, its lights blazing into his boarded-up windows, turning his cabin into a cage of light and shadow. Doors slammed. 4 figures, silhouetted and menacing, approached the house. Vance was in the lead, a fresh contract in his hand. "Last chance, Silas." Vance's voice was sharp, impatient, cutting through the heavy silence. "I've got the papers, a pen, and a very compelling reason for you to sign. My patience has officially run out." Silas remained silent, his knuckles white on the stock of the shotgun. He could hear them on the porch, their heavy boots thudding on the wood like the footsteps of executioners. One of them kicked the door. The old oak shuddered but held, a final act of defiance. "Don't be a damn fool," Vance yelled, his voice laced with the frustration of a man unused to being denied. "There are 4 of us. You think that antique pop gun is going to save you. Another kick, harder this time. The door frame splintered, groaning in protest. Silas raised the shotgun, the barrel steady now. He wasn't a killer, but they were threatening to burn him alive in his own home. The law of the wild was the only law that mattered now, survival. With a final, brutal kick, the door burst inward, ripped from its hinges. The three thugs spilled into the room, fanning out, their faces set in grim masks of casual brutality. One of them held a crowbar. Another had the red jerry can. Vance stood framed in the doorway, a look of triumphant disgust on his face. "See," he said smugly, "I told you it's over." The man with the crowbar lunged. Silas didn't have time to aim. He pulled the trigger. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the small cabin, a blast of sound and fury that threw the thug backward off his feet, his chest a shredded ruin. But the other two were on him in an instant. A heavy boot connected with his side, knocking the wind out of him. The shotgun was wrenched from his grasp. A fist crashed into his jaw, and the world exploded into a starburst of pain. He fell to the floor, the rough wood scraping against his cheek. They beat him. It was not a fight. It was a methodical, brutal dismantling. Kicks to his ribs, his back. A fist to his stomach that made him gag. He curled into a ball, trying to protect his head, the taste of blood and dust filling his mouth. Through the fog of pain, he heard Vance's voice, cold and distant, the sound of a victor dictating terms. "Had enough yet? Or do you need more persuasion?" Vance knelt beside him, waving the contract in front of his face. The ink smelled like poison. "Sign it, you stubborn old bastard. Sign it and this all stops." Silas spat a wad of blood onto the floor near Vance's expensive Italian shoe. "Go to hell," he gasped. Vance stood up, wiping his shoe on a clean patch of floor with a grimace of distaste. "Fine. Have it your way." He nodded to the thug with the gasoline. "Do it. Start with the porch. Let him watch it burn before we toss him in." The thug unscrewed the cap of the jerry can. The sickeningly sweet smell of gasoline filled the cabin, a promise of a horrific end. Silas closed his eyes. He thought of the forest, of the quiet dignity of the trees, of the amber eyes of a wolf pup. He had failed. His stand was meaningless. Greed had won. As the thug began to slosh the flammable liquid onto the porch planks, a sound cut through the night. It wasn't the distant, mournful howl of a lone wolf calling to the moon. This was different. It was close, shockingly close. A single, powerful, resonant howl that seemed to erupt from the very steps of the porch. It wasn't a sound of loneliness. It was a sound of command, a declaration. It vibrated through the floorboards, through the very air in the cabin, a primal chord of authority that stopped everyone in their tracks. The thug with the jerry can froze, mid-pour. Vance and his other man spun around, their eyes wide with confusion and a flicker of primal fear. "What the hell was that?" one of them whispered. Another howl answered the first, this one from the edge of the cornfield. Then another and another from the left, the right, until the night was filled with a terrifying, rising chorus. It was a symphony of predators, a sound that bypassed the rational mind and spoke directly to the ancient, terrified core of human instinct. This wasn't a stray animal. This was a hunt. Vance, for the first time, looked genuinely unnerved. "It's just a damn coyote," he stammered, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "Get on with it." But the thug on the porch didn't move. He was staring, paralyzed, into the darkness just beyond the SUV's headlights. A shape was materializing from the shadows. It was impossibly large, bigger than any coyote, bigger than any dog. Its fur was a mix of silver and shadow, its shoulders thick with muscle. It moved with a fluid, confident grace that was utterly silent. It stepped into the full glare of the headlights, and its eyes glowed with a cold, intelligent fire. On its front right leg, just above the paw, a thin, pale scar was visible even from a distance, and it walked with a barely perceptible limp. It was Runt, but he was no longer a runt. He was magnificent, a creature of breathtaking power and authority. He was an alpha. He stopped at the edge of the porch, lowered his head, and let out a low, rumbling growl that was more felt than heard. It was a sound that promised violence, a warning etched in the ancient language of tooth and claw. Vance and his man took an involuntary step back. "It's a wolf," the thug breathed, his voice trembling. "A goddamn wolf." As if on cue, the alpha raised his head and looked toward the cornfield. And from the darkness between the withered stalks, more shapes emerged. One by one, then in pairs, then in a flood they came. A dozen, then 24 pairs of glowing eyes. The entire pack. They moved with a chilling, coordinated silence, fanning out to form a semicircle, their bodies low to the ground, a living, breathing wall of muscle and teeth. They blocked the driveway. They blocked the path to the woods. They cut off all escape. The air grew thick with a palpable menace. The smell of pine and damp earth was replaced by the musky, feral scent of predator. Silas, lying bruised on the floor, pushed himself up on one elbow, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The wolves were not looking at him. Their collective, unwavering gaze was fixed entirely on Vance and his hired muscle. The scene froze into a tableau of primal terror. Two men, armed with modern weapons of intimidation, a crowbar, a gun, the threat of fire, were suddenly rendered powerless. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey. The remaining thug, who had beaten Silas with such casual brutality, managed to pull a pistol from a holster under his jacket. But his mind was gone, lost to a fear so deep it was genetic. His fingers were clumsy, unresponsive. He fumbled with the safety, his eyes darting between the dozens of silent, watching wolves. He let out a whimper of pure terror as two of the largest wolves detached from the pack and began to stalk toward him, their movements synchronized, their heads low. The pistol fell from his nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud in the dirt. There was no attack on the men. Not yet. The justice being meted out was colder, more psychological. The wolves were dismantling their confidence, stripping them of their weapons and their arrogance, leaving them exposed and terrified. They formed a living, breathing barrier between Silas and his tormentors. Silas, still on the floor, watched in stunned disbelief. The wolves moved with an intelligence that was both beautiful and terrifying. They were a single organism, a pack mind working in perfect, silent unison. He saw the alpha runt look at him for a fraction of a second, and in that gaze he saw the same acknowledgement from 3 years ago, the debt now being repaid in full with interest. Then the true attack began, but it wasn't on the men. With a silent command from the alpha, a half-dozen wolves broke from the main group and descended upon the black SUV. It was a terrifying display of coordinated destruction. They didn't bite the men, they bit the machine. One wolf, a massive black female, sank its teeth into a front tire. With a violent shake of its head, there was a loud hiss as the air rushed out. Another 2 wolves attacked the rear tires, shredding the thick rubber with terrifying ease. The sounds were visceral, the screech of claws on metal, the crunch of teeth on the grill, the sickening pop of tires bursting. They moved like a demolition crew, tearing at the vehicle that had brought this poison to Silas's land. They were erasing the intrusion, dismantling the symbol of Vance's power. One wolf leaped onto the hood, its claws leaving deep gouges in the polished black paint. It stared through the windshield directly at Vance, who was now backed against the cabin wall, his face ashen, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with dirt. The primal justice was absolute. The wolves weren't just saving Silas, they were cleansing the land. They were demonstrating a power that Vance, with all his money and influence, could never comprehend. His power came from paper contracts and bought-off officials. Their power came from the earth itself. The two thugs were frozen, trapped between the cabin and the terrifying wall of wolves. Their escape route was a mangled wreck of steel and rubber, hissing its last breaths onto the gravel. Their weapons lay useless on the ground. They were utterly, completely defeated, not by a man, but by a memory, by an act of kindness returned 1,000-fold. The spell of paralyzed terror finally broke. Arthur Vance, the man who moved through the world with the unshakable certainty of wealth and power, made a sound Silas had never imagined he could produce. It was a high, thin scream of pure, abject fear. It was the sound of a cornered animal. His composure, his arrogance, his entire facade of control shattered into a million pieces. He turned and ran. He didn't run toward the ruined SUV or his useless thugs. He ran blindly, away from the porch, away from the Alpha, scrambling into the darkness toward the county line. It was a panicked, clumsy flight, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the damp ground, one flying off as he stumbled. The Alpha watched him go for a moment, then let out a sharp, commanding bark. It was not a call for a kill. It was a command to chase. Instantly, half the pack broke from their positions and gave pursuit. They did not run as a ravenous mob. They moved like a current, a river of gray and black fur flowing through the night. They herded him. They flanked him, nipping at the air just behind his heels, their hot breath on his skin. Their paws were silent on the earth, a terrifying, relentless rhythm of pursuit. They were not trying to catch him, they were driving him out. The screams grew fainter as Vance crashed through the underbrush, the sounds of his panicked flight swallowed by the immense, indifferent darkness of the woods. The wolves did not bring him down. Their justice was not about death. It was about a message, burned into Vance's soul with the hot iron of terror. This land is protected. It does not belong to you. It is governed by a law older than any deed, older than any bank, older than mankind itself. They chased him all the way to the paved road that marked the county line, a symbolic boundary he had so casually crossed. And there, at the edge of the asphalt, the domain of man, they stopped. They watched as his terrified, stumbling figure disappeared down the road, and then, as one, they turned and melted back into the trees. The message was delivered. The debt was settled. Back at the cabin, the remaining wolves held their positions. The two thugs were huddled together, trembling like leaves in a storm, one of them openly weeping. They didn't dare move. They just stared at the silent, patient predators that surrounded them. The alpha wolf, Runt, slowly walked up the porch steps. He ignored the terrified men. He walked past the spilled gasoline and the discarded weapons and stopped in front of Silas, who had managed to pull himself into a sitting position against the splintered doorframe. The wolf was immense, his head level with Silas's shoulder. He looked at the man, his amber eyes soft now, the cold fire of the hunt replaced by something else. Recognition, gratitude. He nudged his head gently against Silas's arm, a gesture of profound and startling tenderness. Silas, despite the throbbing pain in his ribs and the blood on his lips, reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the wolf's thick neck. The fur was coarse and wild. He could feel the power thrumming beneath the skin, the steady, calm beat of a wild heart. "You came back," Silas whispered, his voice hoarse. "You remembered." The wolf made a low, soft sound in its throat, a sound that was neither a growl nor a whine, but something in between, a communication that transcended language. He had remembered the kindness. He had remembered the warmth of the fire, the gentle hands that had set his bones, the quiet voice that had asked for nothing in return. And when the man who had shown him mercy was in peril, He had brought the full, terrible power of his family to bear. He stayed with Silas for a long moment, a silent communion between two solitary beings who had, against all odds, saved each other. Then the Alpha turned and walked back down the steps. With another silent command, the rest of the pack began to withdraw. They didn't make a sound. They simply dissolved back into the cornfield and the forest, vanishing as quickly and as silently as they had appeared, leaving behind only the scent of the wild and two broken, whimpering men. The night, once again, belonged to Silas. Weeks turned into a quiet, healing month. Silas's bruises faded from purple to yellow, and the ache in his ribs subsided to a dull throb. He repaired his door. This time with new iron hinges he forged himself in his small workshop. He scrubbed the gasoline from his porch, but the scent lingered faintly, a reminder of how close he had come to the end. The burned-out skeleton of his barn stood as a stark monument against the autumn sky. He made no move to clear it, leaving it as a scar on the land, a testament to the battle that had been fought and won there. Of Vance and his thugs there was no sign. The black SUV, a mauled carcass of steel and shredded leather, sat in his driveway for a week, a modern art installation titled Hubris. It became a local curiosity until it was eventually towed away by a bewildered-looking crew from the county, who asked no questions and seemed eager to leave. Rumors trickled in from Blackwood Creek. On a rare trip for supplies, Silas stood in the back of the general store, listening. Arthur Vance had vanished. His local office was shuttered, his projects abandoned overnight. The whispers told a story of a complete financial and psychological collapse. Some said he'd had a nervous breakdown, that he would wake up screaming in the night about wolves. Others said powerful investors, spooked by the sudden halt of the fracking exploration, had called in his debts and ruined him. No one knew the truth and no one cared. He was simply gone, a ghost who had haunted their town and then dissipated. The fear on Main Street was replaced by a wary, fragile relief. Silas, however, still waited for the other shoe to drop. The wolves had saved him from the fire, but they couldn't save him from foreclosure. He expected a formal, impersonal eviction notice, another set of men in suits, perhaps this time with armed marshals, coming to finish what Vance had started. He prepared himself for another fight, though he knew it was one he couldn't win by force. Then one gray afternoon, a single, official-looking envelope arrived in his rusted mailbox. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, the paper feeling heavy with judgment. It wasn't an eviction notice. It was a short, terse letter from the bank's legal department, written in the dense, impenetrable jargon of corporate self-preservation. He read the key paragraph 3 times before the meaning sank through the fog of his disbelief. Due to unforeseen environmental and accessibility issues, including but not limited to the verified presence of a significant and protected native predator species demonstrating aggressive territorial behavior, the property located at is now deemed unviable for seizure, development, or any corporate activity, citing potential legal liabilities and insurmountable insurance costs associated with said wildlife. The outstanding debt on the property has been written off by the institution as a non-performing asset. The title is hereby cleared and released. Silas lowered the letter, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his weathered face, a real smile, the first in years. Inaccessible, aggressive and protected native wildlife. The bank, that faceless, all-powerful entity, had been defeated by a ghost story. Vance, in his terror-fueled reports to his superiors or perhaps even the authorities, must have painted a picture so fraught with risk that the cold calculus of the corporation tipped in Silas's favor. The land was officially worthless to them, and therefore it was priceless to him. He walked out onto his porch, the letter clutched in his hand. He looked out at the edge of the forest, the place where civilization ended and the true world began. He didn't see them, but he knew they were there, watching. The land was his again, not by law or by deed, but by a covenant forged in compassion and repaid in primal loyalty. Nature had called in its own debt, and in doing so, had set him free. The land wasn't just a property anymore. It was a sanctuary, protected by guardians older and more powerful than any human law. He was their keeper and they were his. And in the quiet solitude of his reclaimed world, under the watchful eyes of the forest, Silas was finally, truly home. And so their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. Their story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. The truest debts are not recorded in ledgers, but in acts of compassion, and they are always repaid, often when we need it most. But as one man breaks the system by honoring a law older than money, another finds himself trapped by the very same system he helped create. What happens when a man who has spent his life enforcing the rules is suddenly crushed by them? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence.